Some buildings never sleep, they just change shifts. 14th floor, glass and steel above the Chicago Loop. Before the city finds its footing, the lights on 9 are already burning. Keyboards, phones, the percussion of ambition moving at full tempo. Pull back wider, 40 floors of windows against a gray November sky. Every light a person, every person a calculation. Tighter now. 1 floor, 1 corridor, hardwood catching fluorescent light. A janitor's cart moving east, slow, steady. The man behind it unremarkable in every visible way. Which is exactly the point. Watch his left ear, 1 bud in. Not music, never music. He has pushed this cart down this corridor for 6 years. He has been looked through, stepped around, and spoken in front of. He has heard everything, written down more than anyone knows. The cart stops. A door opens behind him, heels, 4 beats per second. Controlled. Expensive. Coming closer. He already knows what happens next. He has known for 3 months. The floor was never quiet before 8. That was the thing about Hargrove Capital's 9th floor. It didn't warm up slowly. It didn't ease into the morning the way a reasonable place might. It detonated. 6:45 and the lights were already burning. 7 and the phones were already ringing. 7:30 and the whole floor hummed with that particular frequency of people performing urgency. For an audience of other people performing urgency. Keyboards, heels, the squeal of a chair rolling back too fast. The specific silence of someone reading bad news on a screen and deciding not to react yet. James Clark had learned the floor's rhythms the way a man learns a river, not by studying it, by standing in it long enough that the current stopped surprising him. He pushed the cart through the east corridor at 7:52. Same cart he'd used for 3 years after the previous one lost a wheel and maintenance took 6 weeks to replace it. The new one had a slight pull to the left if you let your grip go loose. He didn't let his grip go loose. The mop head was fresh. The bucket smelled like industrial lemon, the kind of lemon that had never been near an actual lemon tree. His uniform was clean and pressed, because he pressed it himself every Sunday evening, while the game played on the television he'd bought, used from a neighbor who moved to Phoenix, 58 years old, 6 feet even, though he'd noticed lately that he stood slightly differently than he used to. Not shorter, just more deliberate, like a man who had stopped trying to take up space and started choosing exactly how much of it he wanted. The earpiece sat in his left ear, 1 bud only, always the left. People assumed it was music. It was not music. He'd stopped listening to music during work shifts 4 years ago, when he realized that music pulled your attention inward, and inward was not where the useful information was. The useful information was always outward. It was the half-sentence cut short when someone noticed him turning the corner. It was the name dropped and then immediately walked back. It was the specific vocal register people used when they thought they were alone. He was never alone on this floor, but he had learned to seem like furniture, and furniture heard everything. The carpet in the east corridor ran from the elevator bank to the copy room, then hardwood from the copy room to the open floor plan where 18 analysts sat in rows that management called pods, and everyone else called what they were, which was rows. James worked the hardwood twice before 9, because foot traffic from the coffee station left a trail of small indignities, spilled drops, tracked-in grit from the parking garage. Once memorably, what appeared to be an entire granola bar crushed methodically into a fine powder over 8 feet of floor. He had not asked, he had cleaned it. He was at the midpoint of the corridor, where the hardwood met the strip of rubber threshold that marked the entrance to the pod area, when he heard the conference room door open behind him. He did not turn around immediately. He never turned around immediately. That was another thing people did not understand about being invisible. The invisible did not react. They absorbed. Turning around at a sound was a sighted person's reflex, the reflex of someone who expected to be seen and therefore expected to matter to whatever had made the noise. James had trained that reflex out of himself over 6 years. He registered the door. He registered the heels. He registered the particular cadence of them. The controlled impact of someone who had decided that the way she walked was itself a form of communication. 4 beats per second. No variation in pace or force. That was Linda Harrison's walk, and James knew it the way he knew the pull on the cart. He kept moving. The thing about Linda Harrison was that she was, in the most purely technical sense of the word, striking. 43 years old, and she wore it like a credential. Dark brown hair swept up and back in a style that cost more per session than James made in a day. A gray suit cut so precisely that it seemed less like clothing and more like a structural decision. She was the kind of woman who made a room recalibrate when she entered it, not because she demanded it but because the room had no choice. People's eyes moved to her automatically. It was a physiological response, like tracking a moving object or following a loud sound. James had watched that happen every day for 18 months. He had also watched what came after the eyes moved to her, which was the micro-adjustment people made. The straightening, the returning of attention to screens with slightly too much focus, the performance of normalcy that was itself evidence of the opposite. He was 5 steps past the threshold when she said the word, web. He stopped. His hands stayed on the cart. He turned. She was looking at him the way she looked at a report with an error in it. Not angry, not contemptuous, just certain that the problem was real and that dealing with it was a matter of efficiency. Her voice came out of her chest and she pointed at the floor ahead of his cart. "You've mopped that section twice since 7. He said the only true thing. "There's a coffee spill near the copy room, Miss Harrison." I didn't ask for the explanation. Her chin dropped approximately 2 degrees, which was her version of a raised eyebrow. I said it's already clean. The floor was clean. That was true. The coffee spill was also true. Both could be true simultaneously, and it did not matter because she was not talking about the floor. He understood this. He said, "Yes, ma'am, put the cart back." The 3-second silence that followed that sentence was not, as anyone watching might have assumed, a silence of hesitation. It was the silence of James Clark doing something he had only permitted himself to do in this building on 4 previous occasions across 6 years. He looked directly at her. Not past her, not at the floor, not at the middle distance. At her face, her actual face. She had not expected that. He pulled the access badge from his chest pocket. He held it out, horizontal, level, waiting for her to take it. He did not drop it at her feet. He did not toss it. He placed it into her open palm, with the same deliberate courtesy he had been extending to this building and everyone in it, since the day he started. The same courtesy that had been mistaken for submission so consistently and for so long that he had stopped bothering to correct the misapprehension. She took the badge. "Effective immediately," she said. The sentence was practiced. She'd used it before. "You're done here." He looked at the badge in her hand for 1 second. Just one. Then, "Are you sure?" She laughed. It was a short sound, dismissive, the laugh of someone who had already walked away from the conversation internally and was just waiting for the rest of her body to catch up. She turned. 4 beats per second, back toward her office. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. The copy room was 12 steps away. James walked to it. He opened his locker, which was a gray metal cabinet behind the paper supply shelves, the kind of cabinet that had been there so long it had merged with the architecture. He took out his jacket, his lunch bag, which he hadn't opened yet, a small notebook, its cover worn smooth and dark from 6 years of pocket friction. He put the jacket on, closed the locker, picked up the notebook. He did not look at the floor. He did not look at the cart. He walked to the elevator and pressed B, going down. 41 seconds. The basement of Hargrove Capital was not technically a basement in the dramatic sense. It was a lower level, a utilitarian space of exposed pipes and utility lighting and storage rooms that smelled like old cardboard and the particular chemical neutrality of environments no one had personalized. The IT infrastructure was 2 floors up in a locked room with climate control and a sign that required a keycard to even approach. What was down here was the other kind of IT, the leftover kind. The kind that had accumulated during the building's previous life under previous management with previous systems and then been neither properly decommissioned nor properly updated, because decommissioning cost money and the compliance documentation required to justify doing nothing cost nothing. James had found the room in his 3rd week. He hadn't been looking for it specifically. He had been looking for the main utility shutoff that the building manager had described in the orientation packet he'd been handed, which turned out to be 2 rooms to the left of where the packet said it was. He'd found the server room by accident while navigating the correction. The door was unlocked. The equipment inside was old enough to have a particular aesthetic to it, the blocky beige and dark gray of machines built in an era when function was everything and form was a word that hadn't reached the IT department yet. He had stood in the doorway for a long time. He hadn't touched anything that first day, or the second day when he went back, or the third, when he pulled a stool from a storage cabinet down the hall and sat for 20 minutes and looked at the setup the way a former surgeon might look at an old operating theater, with recognition, with something close to grief. with the specific clarity of a person who understood exactly what they were looking at. The system was a legacy backup node. It had been part of the building's original compliance infrastructure, the kind required by financial industry regulations that mandated certain categories of communication and access records be retained and verifiable for audit purposes. When the building modernized, someone had migrated most of the data functions to newer systems, but the migration had been, in the way of many such migrations done under budget pressure and deadline stress, incomplete. Specific automated processes had continued running, routing certain data categories to the old system out of bureaucratic momentum, because no one had written the instruction to stop. The system backed up email servers, access logs, timesheet submissions as entered versus timesheet submissions as they appeared in the official HR platform after approval workflows. That last function had taken James 6 months to fully map. He was not in a hurry. He had time. He had, as it turned out, years. The credentials were the original administrative credentials from the system's installation. They had never been changed. He had looked up the default credentials for this specific system version, which was a version he had worked with during his final 18 months as a network systems administrator in Cincinnati, and had entered them on a Tuesday afternoon in October of his first year at Hargrove Capital. They had worked. He had sat with that for a while. He had not extracted anything. He had not accessed anything he did not need to understand the system's function. He had made a note in his notebook, one note, and he had gone back upstairs and mopped the east corridor and gone home. Now he sat at the terminal again. The chair was the same stool from the storage cabinet. He had stopped returning it after the first year. No one had noticed or commented. The screen resolved from black to the familiar interface. He navigated to the file directory he had mapped over the preceding months. The data was there. Of course it was there. It had been accumulating for years, patient and indifferent, in the way that only data and time can be patient and indifferent. He had confirmed 3 months ago that it was sufficient. He had asked Ryan to verify it. Ryan Clark was 30 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and a forensic IT consulting practice in Evanston that he had built from scratch after graduate school. He had driven downtown on a Sunday, which was the only day James could get access to the building without it being remarkable. And he had spent 4 hours in this room with a laptop and an external drive and a series of technical processes that James understood in principle but had not kept current with since 2003. At the end of the 4 hours, Ryan had said, "Dad, where did you get this?" And James had explained, and Ryan had been quiet for a while, and then Ryan had said, "The hash verification is going to be the key. Everything has to have a clean chain of custody." And James had nodded because he had thought about chain of custody for 3 months before calling Ryan and had already identified that as the central problem, and they had worked out the solution together. Father and son in a basement room under fluorescent light, passing a notebook back and forth. James had saved Susan Miller's number on the last day of October. He had not called it, he had waited. 3 months ago, when the pattern in the timesheet data had fully crystallized and the email record had reached a length and specificity that no reasonable person could explain as ambiguous, he had called. He had introduced himself. He had described what he had. Susan Miller had asked him 2 questions, both procedural, both precise. She had said, "I need to see the data. Can you get it to me cleanly?" He had said yes. They had met that following Saturday at her office on North Wacker, and he had handed over the drive that Ryan had prepared. She had called him 5 days later. This is real. He had known it was real. He had known it for years. What he had needed to know was whether real was enough, and what form real needed to take to become actionable. The answer, as it turned out, required 3 months of preparation, and one Monday morning, when a woman in a gray suit took a badge out of his hands and laughed, he pulled out his phone, dialed. Susan Miller answered on the second ring. "James, it's time," he said. A pause. "Professional. Calculating? Then, I'll file today. You understand what happens after that?" "Yes, the company will receive notification. They'll have a right to respond before any public action. But the record locks the moment I file. Nothing can be deleted retroactively. I understand." Another pause. Shorter. "Are you all right?" He looked at the screen, at the data, at 6 years of what a building looks like when no one thinks anyone is paying attention. "Yes," he said. "I'm fine." He sat in the basement for another 20 minutes after the call ended, not doing anything, just sitting. The lights above him buzzed at a frequency he had stopped consciously hearing sometime in year 2. The pipes clicked and settled. Somewhere overhead the floor was running. Phones and keyboards and heels and the particular friction of people moving around each other in a space designed to extract performance and call it culture. He had been part of that floor. Not the visible part, the other part. The part that kept the surfaces clean and the trash emptied and the water cooler refilled and every other physical fact of the environment maintained so that the visible part could continue its performance without interruption. He had been the maintenance of reality, the underneath, the machinery. He had also, simultaneously, been the person in that building who knew it better than anyone else. He opened the notebook to the last written page. The entries were not dramatic, they were the opposite of dramatic. Dates, times, observations, initials instead of names. Shorthand he had developed because the act of writing should look unremarkable to anyone who glanced at it. BT, 7:48 to 10:12, log says 50. KT second request denied. EM email no response noted, file open. He had cross-referenced each entry against the system data as the months accumulated. The notebook was not evidence, it was a map. Evidence was in the drive Susan Miller had locked in her office filing cabinet. He closed the notebook, put it in his jacket pocket, stood. 20 feet above him, in an east corridor of polished hardwood, there was a janitorial cart with a slight pull to the left. Someone would move it eventually. Someone would wonder briefly whose it was. Then they would move on, because the invisible do not leave much of a wake. That was until they do, and by then the wake is something else entirely. He took the elevator back up, not to 9, to the lobby. The lobby of Hargrove Capital was marble and glass, and the kind of lighting that made everyone look competent. Donna Jackson sat at the reception desk, and had sat at the reception desk for 11 years, and had the particular quality of someone who knew everything about the building and was assumed to know nothing, because her job title was receptionist, and people had a tendency to confuse job title with perceptiveness. She was 50 years old with reading glasses on a chain and an uncanny memory for faces. She looked up when James came through the elevator doors. She looked at him, at the jacket, at the notebook in his hand, at his face. She did not say anything. He nodded once. She nodded back, and it was not the nod she gave guests or vendors or the people who breezed through the lobby without looking at her. It was a different nod, the nod of a person acknowledging something they had suspected and were not entirely surprised by. He walked through the lobby and through the glass doors and out into the Chicago morning. It was cold, not brutal cold, not yet, but the particular cold of early November in a city that views warmth as a temporary condition. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Breathing, the city was doing its city thing, cabs and pedestrians and the underground percussion of the train. He had lived in Chicago for 11 years. He had grown to appreciate its indifference. He started walking toward the parking structure. He thought about Cincinnati. He thought about it the way he thought about most things from that period, which was directly and without the softening that nostalgia usually applies to the past. He had been good at his job. That was not ego. That was a measurable fact corroborated by annual reviews, and the specific frustration colleagues had displayed when he left a company, because it meant dealing with his absence in concrete ways. He had been a network systems administrator, with a specific aptitude for identifying structural vulnerabilities in legacy systems, which was, in the language of his field, a valuable and transferable skill. The company had been called Viridian Information Solutions, which was the kind of name that sounded permanent and wasn't. He had been there for 9 years when the wave hit. It wasn't a slow wave. It was the kind that doesn't announce itself, and then arrives all at once, and afterward the landscape doesn't look like the landscape anymore. Offshore contracts, automated processes. The math of labor costs across borders applied with the brisk efficiency of people who had to present the decision to shareholders, rather than to the 300 people who showed up on a Tuesday morning to find their access cards deactivated. He had found out from the parking lot attendant, who had heard from the security guard, who had been told to collect the cards. He had driven home. The divorce was not because of the job loss. That was the story that was easier to tell, and he had told it. But the truth was more accurately that the job loss revealed a foundation that had been weakening for years. Ellen had been patient in the way of someone who was patient with a specific outcome in mind. And when the income went, what remained was not enough to sustain the patience. Ryan had been 10 years old. James had sat in the driveway of the house that he was about to stop being able to afford and understood. very clearly, that the next period of his life was going to be built out of what he actually was, rather than what he had been. What he actually was turned out to be someone who could adapt, who could maintain, who could function across a wide range of conditions without requiring recognition to stay functional. He drove trucks. He worked the overnight shift at a fulfillment center for 2 years. He got his son through high school by working 3 jobs some semesters and 1 solid one in others. He was never impressive during this period. He was consistent. There is a difference, and the difference matters most during the years when it isn't recognized. The janitor work had started in his late 40s. It had suited him more than he expected, not because he lacked ambition, but because ambition had clarified itself by then into something specific. He was not interested in status. He was interested in outcomes, and the outcome he had been moving toward, quietly, since that 3rd week in the basement of Hargrove Capital, had required exactly this kind of work. The kind that allows a man to be anywhere and be noticed by no one. He got to his car, a 2017 Civic dark gray, with a cracked dashboard that he hadn't gotten fixed because fixing it wasn't urgent. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. His phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. "Did you make the call?" He typed back, "Yes. 3 seconds, how do you feel?" He thought about that. He typed, "Ready." Ryan's response came as a single period, which was, James had come to understand over 30 years of parenting a son who communicated in economy, his version of a full sentence of approval. He started the car. Upstairs, on the 9th floor of a building he was no longer technically permitted to enter, Emily Moore was at her desk. She was 29 years old and had been at Hargrove Capital for 2 years and had arrived with a work ethic she'd developed through a childhood in Wisconsin that involved early mornings and the particular self-sufficiency of a family that treated asking for help as a last resort. She had brown hair and the kind of face that registered everything and revealed nothing, which she had developed on purpose after her first 6 months on the 9th floor taught her that revelation was expensive. She was good at her job. She had known since her first month that being good at her job was, in this environment, a complicated credential. She had watched what happened in the corridor from her desk. She had a partial view of the east hallway from where she sat, blocked by the corner of the pod divider, and she had caught only fragments: the cart, the back of James's uniform, Linda Harrison's profile, the arc of something falling, which she later understood had been the badge. She had turned back to her screen immediately, because that was the learned reflex. Do not be seen watching, not be associated with whatever is occurring, because association in this environment moved in one direction, which was downward. But she had kept the image. She kept a lot of images. She kept the image of Brian Thompson coming out of Linda's office in March with a face she had never seen, on a man who had been in the industry for 15 years. The image of Kimberly Taylor's empty desk for 3 days in May, and then Kimberly's return to a different floor, a floor below this one, without explanation. The image of the email she had drafted and deleted 11 times between April and August, the email addressed to HR that described, in careful professional language, a pattern of after-hours requirements that were not appearing in any official record. She had not sent it. She had a lease. She had student loans. She had a mother in Racine who called every Sunday and who had sacrificed things Emily did not have full knowledge of, to help her get to a place where the lease and the loans existed to be paid. She had not sent it. She looked at the empty corridor and then back at her screen. She would think about this later. At her desk, in the afternoon, when the question arrived in her mind with the particular persistence of something that had been waiting, she would think about the man who had pushed a cart through this corridor every morning for 6 years, who had said good morning to her every single day, without fail, without the social calculation that accompanied most good mornings on this floor, who had never once asked her for anything. Brian Thompson was, at that same moment, in a different part of the floor. He was 40 years old and broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that people expected to project certainty, which had caused him a specific and chronic problem for the past 7 months, which was that he did not feel certain about anything that was happening on the 9th floor, and his face was working very hard to conceal this. He was a senior accountant. He had been a senior accountant for 3 years. He had gotten there by being meticulous and thorough, and by maintaining records that were always accurate. That last quality had turned out to be professionally inconvenient. He had a folder on his personal laptop. He had named it Project Files 2023, which was the kind of name that a person gives to something they need to exist, but cannot afford to describe accurately. The folder contained screenshots, timestamps, a chain of 11 text messages that he had not deleted despite having told himself repeatedly that he should delete them. He hadn't deleted them because something in the 30 years of careful financial thinking that constituted his professional identity refused to destroy a record. He had watched the corridor from a different angle than Emily. He had seen it more completely. When it was over, when Linda's heels had retreated and James had gone to the elevator, Brian had turned back to his screen and opened a spreadsheet he was not actually going to work on, and sat in front of it without seeing it for 4 minutes. And in those 4 minutes, he had thought about his daughter Rachel, who was a sophomore at the University of Illinois, and his wife Carol, who was finishing a nursing degree and working overnight shifts at Northwestern Memorial, and the mortgage on the house in Lincolnwood, and the specific calculation a man makes when the thing he knows to be right and the thing he knows to be safe are two different things. He had closed the spreadsheet, opened his email, drafted nothing, closed it. Kimberly Taylor was not on the 9th floor. Kimberly Taylor was on the 7th floor, which she had been assigned to 5 months ago, in a move described in the relevant HR documentation as a structural realignment of resource deployment. She was 35 years old and had worked in HR coordination for 8 years, and had in that time developed a comprehensive understanding of the gap between what organizations said and what organizations did. She had hair that had been described as auburn, by people being generous, and red, by people being accurate, and she kept it pulled back at work because somewhere along the way she had learned that looking unadorned communicated seriousness in a way that other choices didn't. The 7th floor was quieter than the 9th. That was the word she used internally. Quieter, not calmer, not better, quieter, in the way that things are quiet when the interesting problem has been moved elsewhere. She was going through onboarding documents for a new hire and not, simultaneously, thinking about the email she had sent to the HR director 6 months ago. She was not thinking about the 3 days of silence that followed it. She was not thinking about the Tuesday afternoon when she had been called into a meeting and told about the structural realignment while the HR director avoided eye contact. She was not thinking about any of this because she had made a decision in the elevator on her first day on the 7th floor that she was not going to spend her days looking at the things she couldn't change. She was a professional. She processed what was in front of her, but she was also a person who had been doing HR coordination for 8 years, which meant she was a person who knew exactly what a forward chain looked like in an email thread. Who knew exactly what it meant when a message went up and came back down through a different channel than the one it had ascended by. Who had looked at the 3 days of silence and the Tuesday afternoon meeting and drawn, with the quiet precision of someone who does this for a living, the only conclusion the evidence supported. She had not looked for another way to act on it. She had not seen one. She processed the onboarding documents. She made notes. She looked out the window at the part of Chicago that the car flow that the 7th floor revealed, which was different from the part the 9th floor revealed in ways that were purely architectural and entirely felt. None of these 3 people knew that the other 2 were sitting in the same building doing the same internal calculus. None of them had spoken about it. The 9th floor had a specific ecosystem, and part of that ecosystem was a prohibition on certain conversations, a prohibition that was never stated, and therefore could never be challenged on the grounds of being stated, and it enforced itself through the accumulated evidence of what happened to people who violated it. James Clark had mopped this floor for 6 years. He had watched the ecosystem. He had understood it the way you understand a thing when you have no stake in defending it, and therefore no incentive to misread it. He had seen what Linda Harrison had built, and he had seen how she had built it, and he had seen who it cost and how much and when. He had not done anything about it for 3 years. He had needed the data to be sufficient. He had needed the chain of custody to be clean. He had needed a son who was a forensic IT consultant and a labor attorney whose number he had found through 3 degrees of referral from a former colleague who now worked in employment law in Minnesota. He had needed, most of all, the patience to wait until the moment was the right moment, and not just the first possible moment. The first possible moment had passed a year ago. The right moment had been this morning. He had not planned for Linda Harrison to fire him. He had planned for the possibility, and had it not happened today, it would have happened eventually. Because the data he was sitting on was going to generate action regardless of the state of his employment, and his employment was, in the final analysis, not the point. But there was a certain elegance, if a man were permitted to find elegance in things, to the way the morning had gone. She had handed him an exit. She had laughed at his question. She had walked away with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been wrong about who mattered in a room. He drove north on Michigan Avenue. The lake was visible between buildings, gray-green in the November light. He thought about the badge, still on the floor up there, or retrieved by now, or in someone's hand, or discarded. It didn't matter. Objects were objects. What mattered was not in the badge. What mattered was in a filing cabinet on North Wacker Drive. In a folder that had been locked since October, in the hands of a labor attorney who had spent 20 years watching the space between what the law said and what happened to people when no one was watching. That space was about to get considerably smaller. He merged onto the expressway. The city opened up around him, and the radio was off, and he drove in the particular silence of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time, and has now taken the action that will determine what happens next, and cannot yet know the outcome, but is, for the first time in longer than he can easily calculate, no longer waiting. He was 58 years old. He had driven trucks. He had worked overnights. He had raised a son in a house that kept losing rooms as the rent went up, until it was just the two of them in an apartment in Wicker Park that was exactly big enough for what they needed and not 1 square foot bigger. He had learned the server systems of this building, the way he had learned every system he had ever worked with, which was by sitting with them in the dark until he understood what they were actually doing, as opposed to what they were supposed to be doing. He was not, he understood, a hero. Heroes were for a different kind of story. He was a man who had paid attention. For 6 years, in a building where almost no one thought he was worth paying attention to, he had paid attention. He had written things down. He had done the work of understanding what he was looking at before he decided what to do about it. The expressway unspooled in front of him. Behind him, on the 9th floor of a 14-story building in the Chicago Loop, a janitorial cart sat in the east corridor with a slight pull to the left, and the floor ran and hummed and did all the things it did every morning. And 3 different people in 3 different locations were sitting with the weight of things they had witnessed and not yet said. That weight, James knew, had a limit. Everything did. Tuesday arrived the way the second day after a detonation always does. Quietly, almost insultingly quiet. The 9th floor hummed at its regular frequency. The coffee station ran out of the dark roast by 8:15, which was normal. Ashley Thomas rescheduled at 10 o'clock, which was also normal. Linda Harrison arrived at 8:33 with a cinnamon oat latte, and her calendar already mapped to 6 o'clock, and the particular expression of someone who had closed a chapter and was already 3 pages into the next one. The cart was gone from the east corridor. Nobody mentioned it. That was the thing about the 9th floor's particular social contract. Things vanished, and the vanishing was absorbed without comment, because commenting meant noticing and noticing meant proximity, and proximity to the wrong thing at the wrong time was a form of professional liability nobody had the budget for. The cart was gone. The corridor was clean. Life continued, except Emily Moore noticed the cart was gone, because she had sat at her desk every morning for 2 years and the cart had always been there at some point before 9, and its absence was the kind of negative space that only registers when you have been, without fully admitting it to yourself, tracking a presence. She looked at the empty corridor for 3 seconds, looked back at her screen, opened a spreadsheet she had already completed, and began reviewing it with the focused energy of someone engaged in an elaborate pantomime of not thinking about something else. She was thinking about something else. She was thinking about a Monday morning, and a badge, and a man who had looked directly at Linda Harrison. Without flinching, question what the tone of one's a single question with the tone of someone who already knew the answer, and was offering the other opportunity to arrive at it independently. She was thinking about that question, because it had not sounded like a challenge. It had sounded like a door being held open, and the woman on the other side of that door had laughed and walked away. Emily had seen people fired before. She had seen it done badly, which was most of the time. She had seen it done with paperwork and HR protocol and the particular theater of a meeting that everyone knew the purpose of before it started. She had never seen it done like that. The casualness of it, The total absence of ceremony or justification. The taking of a badge from a man's chest like it was a piece of litter he'd been carrying around unnecessarily. She needed to stop thinking about it. She had rent, she had loans, she had a mother in Racine. She opened a second tab and did not search for anything and closed it. Brian Thompson got to the office at 7:48, which was earlier than usual, which was itself a signal that something had changed in him, because Brian was a 7:59 man, had been a 7:59 man since his first week, the product of a domestic schedule timed to the exact interval between dropping his daughter at school and the commute window, and he had never, in 7 years, arrived before 7:52. He had not slept well. He sat at his desk with coffee he didn't taste and opened the accounting software and stared at the quarterly variance report he'd been refining for a week. The folder was still on his laptop. He had considered deleting it 4 times since Monday. 4 times he had opened it. 4 times he had closed it without deleting. He was a meticulous man. Meticulous men do not destroy records, even the records that scare them, especially those. He thought about Rachel at the University of Illinois. He thought about Carol coming home at 6 in the morning from the overnight shift, still in her scrubs, making coffee she was too tired to drink. He thought about the mortgage payment that came out on the 15th, and the fact that he had, at this precise moment in his career, exactly as much leverage as a man who needed his job could be said to have, which was none. He was also a man who had 11 text messages on his phone that he had not deleted. The messages were from his own number. He had sent them to himself in the manner of a person who had not yet decided what to do with information but understood instinctively that the information needed to exist somewhere outside his own memory. They were dated, time-stamped, brief, specific. The kind of documentation a meticulous man produces when his professional instincts override his self-preservation instincts, and he captures data before he can talk himself out of it. He opened the folder, closed it, opened it again and left it open this time, a small act of refusing to decide, because not deciding was its own form of decision, and he had been not deciding for 7 months, and somewhere in the preceding 20 hours that had started to feel untenable. On the 7th floor, Kimberly Taylor arrived at 8, and hung her coat, and sat down and opened the onboarding documentation from the day before, and finished it by 9:15, and sent it to the relevant people, and then sat with the particular stillness of a person whose work is done, and who has not yet found the next piece of work, and who is, in that gap, unprotected from their own thoughts. She thought about the email. She always eventually thought about the email. She had written it carefully. She had rewritten it 4 times, each draft removing one more piece of specificity until she had arrived at language that was accurate without being accusatory and complete without being inflammatory. She had sent it to the HR director because that was the correct channel. She had documented the send. She had waited 3 days, then the meeting, then the 7th floor. She was 35 and she had spent 8 years learning the architecture of workplace systems, the formal ones and the informal ones, and the ones that operated in the space between formal and informal, where most of the actual power lived. She knew what a retaliation looked like. She knew how it was dressed when it didn't want to be recognized. She knew that knowing what something was and being able to do anything about it were 2 entirely separate problems. She processed the next task in her queue. The email that arrived on Brian Thompson's personal account at 10:47 on Tuesday morning came from an address he didn't recognize, Proton Mail. The kind of address that was not remarkable in itself, but was remarkable in context. In the context of arriving at his personal email rather than his work email, which meant whoever sent it had done work to find it. The message was 9 words. You don't have to do this alone. What you have is enough. Signed with a single initial. J. Brian read it 3 times without moving. His coffee had gone cold. Someone 2 pods over was on a call that had apparently reached the part where the person on the other end was being unreasonable, and the person on this end was working hard to remain professional about it. The variance report was still open on his other screen. He typed, "Who is this?" Not a question mark. He was too unsettled for punctuation. The response came in 4 minutes. The man who mopped your floor for 6 years. Brian's hands went still on the keyboard. He thought about Monday morning, about the corridor, about the badge, about the way James Clark had walked to the elevator without looking back, without the performance of dignity that people put on when they felt their dignity was under threat, which meant either the man had no dignity to perform, or he had so much of it that performance was unnecessary. He thought about that for a long moment. Then he opened the folder named Project Files 2023. Kimberly Taylor's email came from the same Proton Mail address, and it landed at 11:22 on her 7th floor workstation, in her personal inbox, where she received alerts from her gym and newsletters she had subscribed to during a period when she was trying to be the kind of person who read newsletters. The email had one additional detail that Brian Thompson's did not have. One sentence that sat at the bottom of the message like a stone dropped into water. The email you sent 6 months ago wasn't deleted. It was forwarded directly to Linda Harrison. I have a copy. Kimberly read it twice. Her hands did not shake. She had trained them, over the course of a career that required regularly receiving difficult information and processing it without visible disruption, to not shake at the first wave of something. She breathed once. Read it again, breathed again. Then she typed, "Who are you? I need to know before I do anything." And 5 minutes later, the guy you said good morning to every day for 2 years. She sat back in her chair, 7th floor. The quit floor. The floor she had been assigned to by a process she understood completely, and that had been designed to be understood as something else. She thought about the email she had written and the care she had put into it, and the 3 days of silence, and the meeting with the indirect eye contact. She thought about 8 years of learning how workplace systems worked and arriving at the specific professional grief of someone who has learned a thing expertly and then watched it be used against them precisely. She typed, "Tell me what you need." The response, "Nothing yet. I need you to know what I know. I'll be in touch." The next 2 days on the 9th floor had a specific texture that was different from the texture of days before them, in ways that would have been invisible to someone observing from outside, but were completely apparent to anyone sitting inside the ecosystem. It was the texture of people who were still performing normalcy, but performing it with slightly less conviction than before. The way an actor performs the same role for the 100th time and has stopped being able to hide that they know what comes next. Linda noticed it on Thursday. She noticed it at 9:17, which was precise, because Linda Harrison's sense of the room she was in had been calibrated over 20 years of operating in environments where reading the room was the difference between leading and being led. She was walking from her office to the print station, a walk she made 3 times a day, and something in the quality of not being looked at was different from the quality of not being looked at that she had cultivated and relied upon for 18 months. People not looking at her because she had trained them not to was one thing. People not looking at her because they were avoiding something was another. The distinction was subtle, and it was everything. She stopped at Ashley's desk. Ashley Thomas was 26 and had the professional manner of someone working very hard to be whatever the person in front of her needed her to be, which was a skill that had served her well on the 9th floor, and was currently serving her in the manner of a tool being used for a purpose it wasn't designed for. "Has Edward Harris been in contact with my office this week?" Ashley's face did the thing it was trained to do, which was remain neutral. But neutral required a fraction of a second of active effort, and Linda had been reading fractions of seconds for 20 years. "No, Miss Harrison." One beat too long on the no. Linda walked to the print station, collected what she needed, walked back to her office, closed the door, which she did not always do at 9:17 on a Thursday. She opened her email. The message from Paul Moore had been sent at 47 that morning, which meant it had been sitting in her inbox for 30 minutes while she'd been in her office reviewing quarterly projections. The subject line was 4 words. The 4 words were confidential. Please review immediately. She read it once fast and retained almost nothing, because her brain was doing what brains do when they receive information that contradicts a load-bearing assumption, which is reject the vocabulary before it can assemble into meaning. She read it again slowly. The words investigation, wage and hour compliance review, system records, preserve all relevant communications pending inquiry. She read it a 3rd time, and this time the words landed in the correct order, and the meaning assembled itself fully, and she sat with it for 4 seconds before standing up. The walk to Brian Thompson's desk took 23 steps. She had taken it before, for different reasons, always different reasons, but the walk itself was familiar, the translation of intent into motion, the clarity of having identified a problem and moving toward its solution. She stopped at his pod. "Brian." The word came out at the right volume and pitch. "Controlled conference room. Now." Brian Thompson looked up from his screen. 7 years. She had known him for 7 years. She knew his face the way you know the faces of people you have watched across a conference table for 7 years, which is to say she knew its default state and its deviation from default state. The face looking at her was not Brian Thompson's professional face or his measured face or his careful face. It was the face of a man who had made a decision sometime in the last 72 hours, and who was now living in the first moments of that decision having been made. I don't think that's appropriate right now, Miss Harrison. Quiet, precise, like a key turning in a lock. She stood very still. She catalogued what was happening. She catalogued it because cataloging was what she did when the ground shifted. It was the thing that kept her operational when other people's first response was to react. Brian Thompson had, in 7 years, disagreed with her approximately 4 times in ways that were productive and collegially appropriate. He had declined an instruction from her 0 times. 0. She was certain of this the way she was certain of numbers she had personally reviewed. She nodded once, said nothing, walked back to her office. She did not close the door this time. Closing the door twice in one morning would be visible. She sat at her desk and opened the email from Paul Moore again, and read it for the 4th time, and thought about the specific nature of what a compliance investigation required, and what it meant for system access, and what it meant for records, and what it meant for the sequence of things that would now need to happen, and in what order. She thought about the badge. She thought about Monday morning and the corridor and the question she had laughed at. Are you sure? She was not at this precise moment sure of anything. The elevator doors on the 9th floor opened at 10:22 on Thursday morning, and the people who happened to be facing in that direction looked up with the automatic attention that elevator arrivals generate, and then experienced a collective moment of processing, because the person who stepped out was familiar and not familiar simultaneously, familiar in the structure of the face and the build, but not in the clothing, or the context, or the position in the room. James Clark wore a white button-down shirt and dark slacks. His hair was combed. He was clean-shaved in a way that required intention. He walked out of the elevator with the straightforward movement of a man who belongs somewhere and knows it. Behind him came Susan Miller. Susan Miller was 45 years old and dressed in a way that communicated that every choice she had made that morning had been deliberate. Her suit was dark. Her briefcase was leather and structured. She had the kind of face that had been described at various points in her career as intimidating, which was a word that specific kinds of people used for women who did not perform uncertainty. Her heels hit the 9th floor's hardwood with a different sound than Linda Harrison's. Where Linda's were rhythm, Susan's were punctuation. Behind Susan came 2 men from IT, identified by their building access badges and the specific neutral expressions of people executing a technical instruction they had been given by someone with authority over their department. Emily Moore was the first person on the floor to register all of them at once. She had turned at the elevator sound out of habit and now sat absolutely still in the particular arrested state of someone whose brain is processing faster than their body can respond to. She looked at James. He looked at her. He gave her the same nod he had given her every morning for 2 years, the small genuine acknowledgement of one person recognizing another person's presence. And the normality of it inside this entirely abnormal moment was the thing that made something move in her chest. Linda Harrison was standing at the end of the corridor. She had come out of her office 2 minutes earlier, for a reason she would not have been able to articulate precisely. A movement generated by the specific instinct of someone who has spent 20 years in high-stakes environments and whose nervous system had begun sending signals that the environment had changed before her conscious mind had caught up to why. She was at the corridor's end, between her office and the open floor, and she saw James and Susan and the 2 IT men, and she processed the visual information with the same speed she processed everything. And then she looked at James, and James looked at her. You did this. Not a question, not an accusation. The flat statement of someone updating their map of reality. James walked toward her, not fast, not with drama. The way he had always moved through this floor, with intention and without performance. He stopped at a reasonable distance. Conversation distance. I did my job, Miss Harrison, for 6 years. She looked at Susan Miller, at the briefcase, at the 2 men from IT moving past them both toward the server access panel near the utility corridor. The picture assembled in her mind with the cruel efficiency of a mind that has been trained to assemble pictures quickly. She looked back at James. She stopped, started again. You were planning this. I was paying attention, he said. There's a difference. Susan Miller set her briefcase on the nearest available surface, which was the edge of the pod divider closest to the corridor. She opened it, removed a folder with the clean movement of someone who has removed this specific folder from this specific case approximately 100 times in preparation and is now doing it for the last time. She set the folder on the pod divider's flat edge. She opened it. The room was doing the thing rooms do when something is occurring that people have been waiting to occur without knowing they were waiting. It was not silent. The phones were still ringing, the HVAC was still running. But the quality of human attention in the space had shifted completely. People had stopped pretending to look at screens. They were looking at the corridor, all of them, the full floor. Susan's voice was even and professional and carried without effort. Ms. Harrison, I'm Susan Miller, labor relations attorney representing a compliance claim filed with the Illinois Department of Labor. What's in this folder is the evidence submitted with that claim. We're here as part of the preliminary notification process, which requires that you be informed of the nature of the claim before formal proceedings begin. You have the right to have your own counsel present for any subsequent discussions. Linda looked at the folder. The first page was a table, clean, simple, 12 names in the left column, 3 numerical columns to the right. Hours worked per building access logs and email server activity timestamps. Hours logged per official HR timesheet records after approval workflows. Differential. The differential column was not small. The differential column was across 12 people and 6 weeks, the kind of number that did not suggest error or oversight. The second page was an email chain. The sender address at the top of every thread was recognizable to anyone on the 9th floor. The content of the emails was specific, granular, detailed instructions about timesheet submission methodology that, read in isolation, might have been interpreted as administrative guidance, and that, read in the context of the differential on page 1, could not be interpreted as anything other than what they were. The third page was an email that Kimberly Taylor had sent 6 months ago to the HR director. Below it, in the thread, was a forward. The forward went to one address. Below the forward was a reply. 2 lines, I'll take care of it. And then, 2 weeks later, a building access reassignment notification. For 1K Taylor, HR coordinator, effective immediately. Linda looked at the third page for a long time. Brian Thompson had stood up from his desk at some point during Susan's opening statement. He was standing at the edge of his pod, not moving forward, just standing, and his face had the quality of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time, and was not certain yet whether he had put it down or was still holding it. You told me to pull the overtime report. His voice came out steadier than he had expected it to. I have the screenshot. It's time-stamped. That was the first stone. Catherine Hill, 31 years old, data analyst, had been at Hargrove Capital for 3 years, and had in that time learned to navigate the 9th floor's specific currents the way a person learns. To navigate a river they have no choice but to cross. She stood up one pod to the left of Brian. Her voice was quieter, but it was there. You told me logging my real hours would make me look like I wasn't a team player. Those words, that specific phrase. Another stone. Robert Williams had been at Hargrove Capital for 10 years, which was long enough to have seen 3 VPs and long enough to understand that the half-life of authority on a floor like this was shorter than the people exercising it ever believed. He was 44, and he had spent those 10 years making a specific calculation over and over again, which was the calculation between what he knew and what it cost to say it. He stood up from his chair at the back of the pod section, and he did not look at the ceiling or the floor or the middle distance. He looked directly at Linda Harrison. You told me to reconsider my future here if I couldn't be flexible on hours. My daughter was a sophomore in college. I was paying tuition. I want you to know that I knew exactly what you were doing when you said it. I knew. I just couldn't afford to know out loud. The room absorbed that sentence. It was the kind of sentence that does not require a response because it is already complete. It had been true before it was said, and it remained true after, and the saying of it changed nothing about its truth, and everything about what the truth could now do. Linda's chin came up approximately 3 degrees. She was assembling something, a response, a reframe. She had built a 20-year career on the speed of her reframes, on the ability to receive incoming information and redirect it before it could land on the audience as what it actually was. Everyone on this floor knows what I've built here. The retention numbers, the throughput metrics, the fact that we came in under budget 3 quarters running. That doesn't happen without a team that's willing to. We're not your team. Emily Moore's voice came from the middle of the pod section, and it was not loud, and it was not practiced, and it had the specific quality of words that have been held for a long time arriving at the air for the first time. We work here. We worked here. And you made it so that the two things felt the same. Linda turned toward her. Emily did not look away. You don't threaten with language. You don't have to. You created a structure where we understood what happened to people who made themselves visible in the wrong way. We watched Kimberly get moved. We understood what that meant. You didn't have to say anything. The architecture did it for you. The architecture did it for you. Something about those words settled into the room differently than the others, settled into it the way a specific kind of statement settles, when it names something everyone present has felt, but no one has yet articulated. Heads moved, faint, almost invisible adjustments. The barely perceptible confirmation of people who have been given language for a thing they had only previously known as sensation. Linda was looking for the person who would look down, the person who would flinch, the person whose nerve would fail in the visible way that nerves do, because in her experience, which was long and not without genuine accomplishment, there was always someone who blinked. You waited for the blink. You worked with the blink. No one blinked. She looked at James. He was standing near the corridor wall. He had not moved to the center of the room. He had not made a speech. He had not performed anything. He was simply there, the way he had been simply there every morning for 6 years. And the fact of his presence in this context, in this clothing, with this attorney, on this floor that had consumed him as furniture and then been startled to discover it had been talking in front of a person, that fact was doing everything that needed to be done without any help from him. She tried one more time. This is coordinated. She pointed at James. Whatever he told you, whatever he gave you, there are explanations. For all of it, the system he accessed was legacy infrastructure that wasn't properly decommissioned, which means the data it contains is not necessarily. The data is authenticated. Susan Miller's voice had the quality of a closing door. Quiet, final, completely certain. Chain of custody documentation. Third-party forensic verification. The access methodology is fully documented and does not constitute unauthorized access under Illinois statute because the system remained active and the credentials used were original administrative credentials that were never revoked. Your IT department can confirm that. She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. The email chain is from your address, Ms. Harrison. The timestamps are from your sent folder. The forward to your address from HR Director Carolyn Webb is part of the original server log and was not retrieved from your inbox, which means it exists independently of any action you could have taken with your own account. Linda's jaw moved, stopped, and the building access logs that created the differential in that table were generated by the security system on the ground floor, which operates independently of the HR platform and has no connection to any system your department has administrative access to. The floor was very quiet now, not the quiet of held breath, the other quiet, the quiet of people who have been inhaling the same air for a long time and have just noticed that it is different air than it was before. Edward Harris appeared from the direction of the stairwell door, which meant he had walked down from 12 rather than taking the elevator, which was not something the CTO of a 14-floor financial company normally did. He was 52 and built with the economy of a man who had spent his career being useful rather than visible, and he walked to the center of the floor without acknowledgement of the specific drama he was entering. He looked at the 2 IT men proceed. One of them opened a laptop, made 2 entries, looked up, done. Every screen on the 9th floor changed simultaneously. It was not a dramatic visual, it was white text on a dark background, and it was 4 words. Administrative access suspended. Compliance review pending. 4 words and the specific implications of those 4 words inside a financial services environment where data access was not an amenity but an operational function, and Linda Harrison understood those implications in the same second that her eyes finished reading them. Understood them with the precise professional comprehension of a person who had spent 18 months controlling who could see what. She could not control who could see what anymore. Edward. Her voice had changed. Not broken, not yet, but the register had shifted the way the register shifts when the instrument producing it is under structural stress. You need to hear my side of this before you make any decisions that, Linda. Edward Harris looked at her without visible emotion and without visible cruelty, and with the particular quality of a man who has made a decision through a process that has already concluded. HR director is waiting on 12. Susan Miller will accompany you. You can have your counsel present. She stood in the center of the 9th floor, the floor that she had run for 18 months, the floor where she had arrived early and left late and built, by her own accounting, something worth building. The floor where she had made decisions that she had understood at the time as necessary and which she had not spent significant energy examining afterward, because examination of that kind was a luxury she associated with people who did not have to produce results. She looked at the faces around her, not the faces of an audience, the faces of people who had spent a year and a half learning how to not be visible to her, and who were now, for the first time in her tenure on this floor, fully present and fully looking. Not with anger. Anger would have been simpler, with something that landed differently than anger. The quiet and entirely serious regard of people who have just discovered that they existed more than they were allowed to know. James Clark was still at the corridor wall. She looked at him last. He looked back at her the way he had looked at her on Monday morning, with the same steadiness, with the same absence of theater. And then, because he was the kind of man he was, because 30 years of work and loss and patience had made him something that did not need the moment to be larger than it was, he simply held her gaze without adding anything to it, without triumph, without score settling. Just the fact of two people in a room, one of whom had believed the other was not worth looking at, and one of whom had been looking at everything for 6 years. She was the one who looked away. She walked toward the elevator. Ashley Thomas had moved to the side of the corridor without being asked. The unconscious accommodation of someone who has registered a shift in weight distribution in a room and adjusted accordingly. The elevator arrived. Linda stepped in. The doors closed. The 9th floor breathed, not loudly, not with any ceremony, just the collective physiological event of people whose diaphragms had been operating at reduced capacity for some time, returning, without fanfare, to full function. Emily Moore sat back down in her chair. She was not sure when she had stood up. She looked at her hands for a moment. They were steady, which surprised her until she thought about it and realized it shouldn't have. Brian Thompson sat down too. He opened the folder on his laptop. He looked at it for a long time. Then he closed it. Not because he was done with it, but because for the first time in 7 months the folder did not feel like something he was hiding. It felt like a record, which was what it had always been. Susan Miller was on her phone, quiet and efficient, 3 steps from where she'd been standing. James had moved to the window. He stood looking out at Chicago doing its Thursday thing in November. The gray lake visible between buildings, the specific texture of a city that has been standing in weather for a long time and has stopped requiring reassurance about its own permanence. Robert Williams walked over to where James stood. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood beside him for a moment, in the way that men sometimes communicate the things that are too large for the available language. Then, how long did you know? James didn't look away from the window. Long enough to do something about it. Robert absorbed that. Why wait? Because the right moment and the first moment aren't the same thing. James turned from the window, and because doing it right mattered more than doing it fast, Robert Williams looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the room behind them, the floor, the people, the screens with their compliance notifications still running. He looked at the empty space where Linda Harrison had been standing. He had worked on this floor for 10 years. He had made the calculation and made it, over and over, the calculation between truth and safety, and he had chosen safety every single time. He was 44 years old, and he understood that he would spend some time in the coming months looking at the specific character of that choice, not with regret, exactly, with the particular form of honesty that becomes available when the thing you were afraid of has finally happened and you are still improbably standing. He nodded once, went back to his desk. Emily Moore was typing something. She would delete it 3 times before she sent it, but she was going to send it. It was an email to a colleague on the 11th floor who had mentioned once, 8 months ago, a situation on her floor that sounded familiar. Emily had smiled and changed the subject at the time. She was not changing the subject this time. Kimberly Taylor on the 7th floor received a text at 11:44 from a number she had added to her contacts on Tuesday. 2 words, it's done. She sat with that for a moment. Then she began composing an email to the HR director. A different kind of email than the one she had sent 6 months ago. This one did not soften the language. This one did not perform careful neutrality. This one was written by a woman who had spent 8 years learning how systems work, and who understood now, in the specific way you understand things, when the blocking structure has been removed, that she knew exactly how to document what had happened to her and exactly where that documentation needed to go. She typed the subject line first. She looked at it, decided it was accurate, left it, began. The elevator to the 12th floor took 41 seconds. Linda Harrison counted them, not deliberately, involuntarily. The way you count things when your mind needs something small and measurable to hold on to, because everything large and immeasurable is currently in free fall. Susan Miller stood to her left and did not speak. The two of them and the elevator and 41 seconds and the specific weight of a morning that had already been longer than most years. The 12th floor was different from the 9th in the way that all executive floors are different from operational floors, which is to say it was quieter and more expensive, and designed to communicate that the people who worked here had moved past the phase of their careers where they needed to be seen working. Glass walls. Actual wood on the conference table. The kind of carpet that absorbed sound so thoroughly it felt like walking on a held breath. Paul Moore was already in the conference room, 50 years old. Gray at the temples in a way that looked considered rather than accidental. He had been Hargrove Capital's general counsel for 9 years, and had the specific professional bearing of someone who has spent 9 years being the person in the room who knows exactly what the room's options are, and has learned not to express any personal opinion about those options unless directly asked, and sometimes not even then. He stood when the door opened, not out of courtesy, out of the habit of someone who stands at the start of difficult conversations because it equalizes the room before anyone sits. Linda's own attorney arrived 4 minutes later. His name was Stephen Caldwell, and he was very good at his job, which was the specific job of arriving after something had already happened and applying professional competence to the question of what could still be salvaged. He was 53 and wore a watch that communicated his billing rate without requiring him to state it. He sat next to Linda and opened his laptop and did not look at the folder Susan Miller had placed on the table. Then he looked at it. Then he looked at Linda. She gave him a very small headshake. Later, his jaw moved fractionally. He turned to face Paul Moore. The conversation that followed was not the conversation of a courtroom or a confrontation. It was quieter than that, more technical. The specific register of people who communicate in statute and precedent, and the carefully bounded language of formal process. People for whom emotion is not absent but is rigorously subordinated to the structure of arguable positions. Susan Miller laid out the claim, with the methodical clarity of someone who had been building this particular case for 3 months, and had anticipated every counterposition available. Paul Moore listened with the focused attention of a man doing real-time legal assessment. Stephen Caldwell took notes and asked 3 procedural questions, each of which Susan answered without consulting anything. Linda sat through the first 40 minutes without speaking. This was not characteristic. She knew it was not characteristic, and she also knew that Stephen Caldwell had told her once, in a previous professional context she now found bitterly instructive, that the most valuable thing a client could do in an initial adverse meeting was to say precisely nothing, and allow the legal architecture to be fully revealed before attempting to engage with it. She had filed that advice away as useful and had never expected to need it in this direction. She needed it now. The data was real. She had understood that the moment she saw page 1 of the folder. She had built her career on reading numbers, and the numbers on page 1 were not ambiguous. The email chain on page 2 was her own words in her own syntax from her own address, and she could not read it and argue that it said something other than what it said. The forward chain on page 3 was the piece that sat in the center of her chest like a stone, not because it was the most legally dangerous element, though it might be, but because it represented the specific moment where she had received a clear signal and had responded to it in the way she had responded, which was a response she had made instantly and without deliberation, and which was, in the unmerciful clarity of retrospect, the decision that had made every other decision unchallengeable. Kimberly Taylor had done the right thing, the correct professional thing, the thing the system existed to allow, and Linda had taken that signal and converted it into a personnel action. She had done it efficiently, and she had done it without excessive thought, and she had done it because it was the kind of decision that had always, in her experience, worked. Problems that could walk were easier to manage than problems that could speak, except this problem had not stopped speaking. It had just moved to a different room. Stephen Caldwell leaned toward her at minute 47. His voice was below the level of the room's other conversation, which Paul and Susan were continuing with the focused courtesy of people who understood that a sidebar was occurring and were allowing it the space it required. They have the forward chain, Linda. That's the piece. I know. Intent is very hard to argue around once you have a documented response to a protected communication. I know. The differential is significant. If the DOL moves forward, we're looking at back wages, penalties, potentially a class determination if...
What's the alternative?
Not a question. A request for the map of what remained. Stephen was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means the map is not large. Negotiate the terms of departure now before this goes external. The company has incentive to resolve internally. Cleaner for their regulatory profile. But it requires agreement on the record-clearing piece, which they're going to want specific terms around. He paused. And it requires you to stop being in this position by tomorrow morning. She looked at the table. Good wood. The kind that had been something alive before it was a surface for conversations like this one. She had sat at tables like this her entire career. She had sat at the head of most of them. She thought about that. About what it had taken to get to those chairs and what she had understood, sitting in them, to be the nature of the work. She had believed, with the conviction of someone who has turned belief into methodology, that the floor ran on performance, that the metric was output, that the things you had to do to extract that output from an environment of limited resources and competing pressures were the things you had to do, and that the people you had to do them to understood. This at some level, the level of professionals who had signed on for a demanding industry and knew the cost of the territory. She had not thought of them as people who would not understand this. She had not, she recognized now, thought about what they understood at all. Paul Moore's voice. We'd like to move to the resolution conversation if everyone's ready. Stephen Caldwell looked at Linda. She looked at Paul. Yes, she said. The word came out even. She was good at even. Let's do that. 3 floors below, the 9th floor had returned to something that resembled its operational surface. Phones, keyboards, the visual texture of people at work. But the resemblance was only superficial. What was actually happening on the 9th floor at 12:15 on a Thursday was something that had no official term in management literature, which was the process of a group of people recalibrating their relationship to a shared environment after the structure that had organized. That environment had been abruptly removed. It felt to the people inside it like the moment after a very long headache stops, the absence of pain being its own distinct sensation. Emily Moore had sent the email. She had sent it at 11:52, and had then sat very still for 6 minutes waiting for the particular regret that she had associated, across her entire career, with the act of saying something she had been told not to say. The regret had not arrived. What arrived instead was a response at 12:03 from the colleague on the 11th floor. Finally. Can we talk? She typed back, yes, today. Brian Thompson had closed the Project Files 2023 folder at some point during the morning and had not reopened it. Not because he was done with it, because for the first time in 7 months it had stopped being the thing in the room that required constant management. It existed. It was documented. It was in the right hands. He had spent 7 months treating it as a liability, and it turned out it had always been simply a record. The difference between those two things was not in the folder. It was in the conditions surrounding it. He ate lunch at his desk and called his wife, and told her something had happened at work that he would explain when she got home. Carol had the specific perceptiveness of a woman who had been married to Brian Thompson for 16 years, and who understood that when he used that particular sentence construction, the something was significant. Are you okay? Quiet, focused. Yes, he said, and he was surprised to find it was true. I actually think I am. Kimberly Taylor finished her email at 1:47. It was 6 paragraphs. Specific, documented, professional. She read it 3 times and changed 2 words and then sent it to the HR director and copied Paul Moore's office and, on a separate email, Susan Miller. She sat back and looked at the 7th floor's ceiling tiles for a moment. They were the same ceiling tiles they had always been. They had not changed. She had changed in relation to them, which was entirely different and entirely enough. The meeting on the 12th floor ended at 2:14. Linda Harrison had not cried. This was a fact she would return to later, examining it from different angles, uncertain whether it reflected composure or the specific numbness of someone who has not yet fully received what has occurred. She had spoken clearly and responded to questions with accuracy, and had made 3 points of clarification that Stephen had supported and which Paul Moore had acknowledged and which had, in the final accounting, made no substantive difference to the outcome. The documentation was what it was. The forward chain was what it was. She signed the resignation agreement at 2:17. The pen was a good pen. Corporate quality, the kind that every 12th floor conference room stocked in the holder at the table's center. She wrote her name in her standard signature, which she had used for 20 years and which took approximately 2 seconds to produce. She put the pen down. The terms of the agreement include the return of all company property and a non-disparagement clause. Running in both directions, Paul Moore said. Professional, precise. Transition of your access and responsibilities will be handled by IT and your direct reports over the next 48 hours. She stood. Stephen Caldwell stood with her. He put his laptop in his bag with the practiced motion of a man who closes a lot of chapters and has learned not to editorialize. At the door he said, just to her quietly, "For what it's worth, you're not the first person I've represented in this situation." She looked at him. "You're not the last either," he said. "The ones who do better afterward are the ones who spend less time arguing about what the documents said, and more time thinking about what they didn't write down when they should have." She did not respond. She walked out of the conference room and past the reception area on 12 and to the elevator. She pressed the lobby button, not 9, not her office, the lobby. She had a box of personal items that would need to be collected but that could be collected later, by arrangement, and she was not going to the 9th floor again. She had understood this in the elevator coming up, in the 41 seconds of counting, and she was not going to revisit it. The lobby was doing its Thursday thing. Donna Jackson was at the reception desk. Linda walked past without looking at her, through the glass doors, into the November air. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city continued. Which it does. Which it always does. The city's indifference was right now the most neutral thing she could think of, and she was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for things that require nothing from you. She walked to the parking structure. Donna Jackson watched her go through the glass doors with the particular attention she brought to everything that moved through her lobby, which was total and invisible in equal measure. She noted the time. She noted the absence of a box, which told her something. She noted the direction Linda had walked, which told her more. Then she picked up her desk phone and made one call, 2 floors down, to the building management office, and said, "The 12th floor conference room's going to need a reset. They're done up there." The person on the other end said they'd send someone up. Donna replaced the receiver and went back to her work. At 3:48, James Clark walked through the lobby doors. He was still in the white shirt and the dark slacks, though the top button had been opened in the way that marks the specific transition from formal context mode to post-formal context mode in men who have been in formal contexts all day. He carried the small notebook in his left hand. He had been in Susan Miller's office for most of the afternoon. The part of legal process that nobody shows in the movies, which is the signing of things, and the verification of things, and the procedural documentation of the resolution of things, the paperwork that turns events into records, and records into permanent facts. Donna looked up, and she stood up. She did not do this for most people. She did it for the mayor once, when he had come for a ribbon-cutting event, and she had done it for the Hargrove family patriarch when he had visited the building that bore his name 2 years before he died, and she did it for James Clark on a Thursday afternoon in November, because she had watched him walk through this lobby every working day for 6 years, and she had seen what had happened on Monday morning, and she had spent the intervening days knowing something without knowing what she knew, and now she knew what she had known. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. He looked at her and gave her the nod, the genuine one, the one that said, "I see you as a person and your presence in this moment is registered and matters to me." She gave it back, the full version. He crossed to the elevator, pressed 9, going up. The 9th floor at 3:50 was running on afternoon energy, which was different from morning energy in the way that the end is different from its beginning, even when the surface activity looks similar. People were at their desks. The phones had slowed. The light through the windows had shifted into the amber register that Chicago produces in November when the cloud cover breaks late and briefly. Emily Moore saw the elevator doors open. She had been watching them, without knowing she was watching them, in the way she had watched the corridor for a cot that was no longer there. James stepped out. He looked at the floor. The floor looked at him, or the parts of it that were positioned to look did, and the parts that weren't repositioned in the small unconscious ways of people who have registered that something worth seeing is happening. He walked to Emily's pod. She stood up before he reached it, and this was not a social reflex, it was something she did not plan and could not afterward have explained except as the body's understanding of what a moment required before the mind caught up to it. "Are you all right?" Her voice was careful, not fragile. Careful, which is different. "I'm fine." A pause. "It's done." She absorbed that, took a breath. "What happens to us now?" The 12 people on that list. Back wages. Penalty interest under Illinois statute. Susan will contact everyone directly. You'll receive formal notification before end of week. She was quiet for a moment, working through something. Then, "What made you wait? If you had this for months?" Because going too early would have given them time to dispute the methodology. And because the people on that floor needed to be ready to speak, not just have someone speaking for them. He paused. "There's a difference between rescuing people and creating conditions where they can act. I wasn't interested in the first one." She looked at him for a long moment. She was 29 years old and had 2 years of experience on a floor that had taught her, systematically and without apology, to distrust the distance between what an institution said and what it did. She was going to carry some of that for a while. She knew that. But she was also, in this moment, standing in a room where 12 people's names were in a legal document that had been filed with the state of Illinois, and the man who had made that possible was standing in front of her, in a white button-down shirt with a worn notebook in his hand, and none of it had required anyone to be heroic. It had only required one person to pay attention for long enough. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," he told her. And then, because it was true and because true things are worth being precise about, "All of you. I just made sure someone was listening." He moved down the corridor. Brian Thompson was at his desk, and when James reached the pod, Brian stood in the way of a man who has spent the day in the specific company of his own conscience and has reached a kind of provisional peace with what he found there. They did not shake hands. That would have been too formal for what was actually between them, which was the shared understanding of two people who had been in the same building during the same extended wrong and had arrived at the same Thursday from entirely different distances. "You all right?" James asked. "Getting there." Brian looked at his screen, at the closed folder whose icon he could see without opening it. "My daughter called this afternoon. Somehow she'd heard something. I don't know how. You know how they know things at that age," she said. "Dad, did you do the right thing?" He paused. "I told her I didn't do it alone." James nodded. "She said that's what makes it count," Brian said. And then, because he was a meticulous man who understood the value of accuracy, "She's right, I think." James left the pod and walked to the window. Chicago in late afternoon. The lake gray and permanent, the traffic making its way through the street grid in the patient and exasperated manner of city traffic everywhere. The universal human experience of needing to be somewhere and being impeded by the collective fact of everyone else also needing to be somewhere. He had stood at this window before, not at this window specifically. This was the pod section window, but at windows on this floor, with mop and cart, working, and he had looked out at this same view dozens of times across 6 years, and the view had been the same and he had been the same. And now something had changed that was not the view and was not entirely him either, but was the relationship between him and the floor he was standing on, which was different in a way that could not be measured by any available metric, but was as real as the lake. Robert Williams appeared beside him. Different from Tuesday. Something in the set of the shoulders that had shifted since the morning, a barely visible unburdening that manifested in the specific way the body carries itself when it has put down something it had been holding long enough to forget it was holding it. They stood for a moment without talking. "My wife asked me tonight what I was going to do differently," Robert said. "Finally. I didn't have a good answer." "What did you say?" "I said I was going to start logging my hours correctly, a beat." She said, "Robert, that's not what I meant." He exhaled. "She meant who I was going to be, on this floor, day to day." James looked at the lake. "That's a longer answer." "Yeah." Robert looked at it too. "But I think I know the beginning of it." He walked back to his desk. James stayed at the window for another 2 minutes. He was thinking about Susan Miller's office and the paperwork and the specific process of something that has been built quietly and over time finally arriving at the form where it can be witnessed by people with the authority to act on it. He was thinking about Ryan, who had texted at 2:30 asking if it was over, and to whom he had responded yes, and from whom the response had been a single word, good. Not proud, not congratulations, good, which in Ryan's vocabulary was the word for things that had been done correctly and had therefore produced the correct result, and which was the most complete form of approval James had received in 30 years of parenting a son who communicated in economy. He was thinking about Cincinnati, about the Tuesday morning in 2002, when he had driven home from a parking lot with his access card in his pocket and no job on the other side of it, about the specific education of that period, the years of work that asked nothing of him except presence and competence, and which had given him, in return, an understanding of the texture of things, what floors felt like under different shoes, what buildings sounded like at different hours, what people said when they forgot someone was in the room. He had not spent the last 6 years in this building waiting for revenge. That word had never occurred to him in relation to what he was doing. What he had been doing was accumulating the knowledge necessary to tell a true story to someone with the authority to receive it. The distinction mattered to him. It was the distinction between a man who acts from injury and a man who acts from understanding. And while both might arrive at similar external outcomes, only one of them could have produced what had happened on the 9th floor that morning, without burning the floor down in the process. He thought about Kimberly Taylor on the 7th floor. She had sent the email. He didn't know the contents, but he knew the act, because Susan Miller had texted him at 2:01 to say that a supplementary complaint from a K. Taylor had been received and would be incorporated into the formal record. He thought about what it had cost Kimberly to send the first email, the one 6 months ago, and what it had cost her differently to send this one. Different costs. The first one had been paid out in hope. The second one had been paid out in something that was past hope, and into the specific clarity of someone who knows exactly what they are saying, and to whom and why. He put the notebook in his jacket pocket. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. The doors opened. He stepped in and turned to face the floor. The 9th floor of Hargrove Capitol at 4 o'clock on a Thursday in November. The pods, the windows, the hardwood, the carpet in the east corridor, the copy room door, the conference room where Linda Harrison had emerged at 8:51 on a Monday morning, with her mind already 3 conversations ahead of the one she was about to have. The fluorescent light in the utility corridor that had been flickering since March, and which someone had filed a maintenance request about, and which remained, as of this moment, flickering. The weight of ordinary work being done by people who had, today, discovered something about the weight of ordinary work. The elevator doors closed. Going down the lobby, Donna Jackson at her desk. She looked up as he passed, and this time she said something, one word, quiet, hey. The word that in Chicago carries the same semantic weight as an entire sentence. He stopped. She reached under her desk and came up with something small and plastic. A building access badge. His badge. Would you treat them with kindness? Which had been on the floor of the East Corridor on Monday morning, and which had apparently made a journey through the succeeding days that he had not tracked, and which he understood, looking at it now in Donna's hand, had arrived here through some chain of custody he did not need to fully know. He looked at the badge. Donna set it on the desks between them. Came off a desk on 9, she said. Thought you should have it. He picked it up. He looked at it for a moment. His name, his photo from 6 years ago, the Hargrove Capitol logo, the small magnetic strip on the back that had opened doors and logged times and generated the building access records that had become, in Susan Miller's folder, a column of numbers that told a true story about 6 weeks of other people's time. He put it in his jacket pocket, next to the notebook. Thank you, Donna. He sat back down. You've take care of yourself out there. Said the way a person says it when they mean the literal thing and not the social valedictory thing. I will, he said, through the glass doors and into the late afternoon. Chicago had moved into early evening mode, the specific gear shift of a city transitioning from workday pressure to the slightly looser energy of people who have survived another Thursday and are now calculating what Thursday evening has to offer. The temperature had dropped. He buttoned his jacket. The parking structure was half a block east. He was 58 years old. He had driven trucks and worked overnights and mopped floors and raised a son and learned, over the long and not particularly photogenic middle section of his life, that the things people considered invisible were only invisible to the people who had decided not to look. He had spent 6 years on a floor where he was, by general consensus, furniture. He had used that consensus the way a patient and practical man uses the tools available to him. He walked to his car. Ryan called at 4:30, as James was getting on the expressway. He answered through the car speakers. "Dad, hey, I've been thinking about something all day." A pause. "You had that data for 3 months before anything happened. You could have filed sooner." "Yes, why didn't you?" He merged into the center lane. "Because I needed to know the people on floor were going to be okay after. Not just compensated, actually okay, and that takes longer than the documentation does." Silence on the line. Ryan processing. "How did you know they were ready?" "I didn't, completely, but I'd watched them for 6 years. You learn things." Another merge. When Brian stopped deleting the folder. When Emily started looking at HR's number and actually writing the email instead of closing the tab. When Kimberly started using her work email to sign up for labor law updates instead of her personal one. Small things. But small things are the only honest thing. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. "Then I want to write this up, as a case study, with your permission. The forensic methodology we used, the chain of custody documentation. There are a lot of cases like this one where the data exists and nobody knows it exists or how to use it." James thought about that. About other buildings, other floors, other people moving through corridors that didn't see them. "Yes," he said, "do it right, always, a beat." "You coming for dinner Sunday?" "Yes, Carol's making that chicken thing." "I know, you told me last week. Just making sure you had something to look forward to." He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't require a witness. "I do," he said. The expressway moved. Chicago thinned around the car as the distance from downtown accumulated. He drove in the way he had always driven, steadily and without performance, his hands at the wheel and his attention on the road, and the particular quiet of a car moving through evening traffic while the radio stays off, because the inside of a quiet car is one of the remaining places where a person can think without managing the thinking for an audience. He thought about Monday morning, about the badge, about a laugh and a retreating set of heels and a question that had hung in a corridor long enough for the world to rearrange itself into the shape the answer required. He thought about how long he had stood in the basement with his hand on a terminal before he let himself understand what he was looking at. He thought about patience, not the passive kind, the kind that requires you to stay engaged with a situation across time without allowing urgency or anger to compress the timeline before the timeline is ready. He thought about what he was going to do next. Susan Miller had mentioned, at the end of the afternoon, that she had 2 other cases where the technical documentation problems were similar to his, and where, if the methodology he and Ryan had developed could be adapted, there might be a path through the evidentiary challenges that currently had both cases stalled. She had said it carefully, in the manner of a person who understands the difference between an obligation and an opportunity, and is trying not to impose either. He had said, "Let me think about it." He was thinking about it. He had thought a year ago that the work ended when the filing happened. He understood now that the filing was the beginning of a different kind of work, and that the skill set required for work was not entirely different from the skill set required for 6 years in a building where nobody thought you were worth looking at. Attention, patience, the willingness to be underestimated by people who needed to underestimate you to feel safe. He had those things in quantity. He had not figured out yet what shape they would take from here. That was all right. He had learned over 58 years of evidence that the shape a life took was less often the product of a plan than it was the product of the quality of the attention brought to what was immediately in front of it. He had brought good attention to 6 years of floors and corridors and a server room in a basement. Something had come from that. Something else would come from whatever came next. The exit appeared. He took it. The streets of his neighborhood received him the way they always did, without ceremony. A gas station, a dry cleaner with the hours posted in the window in a font that had not been updated since the 90s. A park where 2 people walked a dog in the specific purposeful way of people who are walking a dog as a relational activity and not simply as a functional one. An apartment building, his 3 stories. The 2nd floor unit on the right with the light already on because he had put it on a timer 4 years ago, because coming home to a dark apartment was a thing he had decided he did not need to do. He parked the car, sat for a moment. The notebook was in his pocket. The badge was in his pocket. The last entry in the notebook was from Sunday evening, a note about the system confirmation he had run before the Monday morning decision, the final technical verification, the last piece of the preparation. He would not write another entry in this notebook. He had already started a new one. He got out of the car. The air was cold now, full November, the kind of cold that is not yet serious but is beginning its campaign. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the second-floor window, and the light behind it, which was the same light it always was and which was, right now, the most reasonable and sufficient thing in his immediate landscape. He went inside. The apartment was quiet and warm and exactly the size it needed to be. He hung his jacket, made coffee because it was that kind of evening, the kind that requires coffee more than it requires anything else. Stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The street below was doing its early evening thing. Ordinary, continuous. The city exercising its relentless default activity of existing regardless of what any particular person within it was going through. He poured the coffee, sat at the kitchen table. He took the badge out of his jacket pocket, set it on the table in front of him. His photograph from 6 years ago looked up at him. He looked back at it. The face in the photo was the same face. It had arrived at the same Thursday by a different route than he might have predicted when that photo was taken. But routes were like that. They looked straight until they didn't, and then they looked inevitable. He picked up his phone, texted Ryan, "Sunday works. Tell Carol the chicken thing is appreciated." He set the phone down, drank his coffee. The badge sat on the table, and the light was on, and the coffee was the right temperature, and outside, in a 14-story building in the Chicago Loop, a 9th floor was running its late Thursday operation. Phones and keyboards, and the particular winding down energy of people preparing to finish and go home. Some of those people had a slightly different relationship to that floor than they'd had that morning. Not dramatic, not transformed, just different in the specific and durable way that comes from discovering that the thing you thought you couldn't do turned out to be the thing you had already done. That was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough.